Yeah, why doesn't it apply to the amount of solar systems just in our universe, the Goldilocks effect? Why
Because,
the universe?
good question, because if you actually look around our universe, you will find, in fact, because of recent research, I think it's the Kepler telescope, has discovered a whole range of solar systems with planets that could support life. So there is a strong possibility that life could exist on other planets, exoplanets, in solar systems a long way away. So it doesn't only apply to our solar system, but it does apply to our universe, and that's the key. So our universe has a set of physical constants. I mean, the best thing to do is to read Lord Rees's book, and you'll get an appreciation of what that means. And in fact, interestingly, he writes in his book, these 6 constants appear to indicate that there must be a creator of the world who set this all up. Right? But that can't possibly be because we don't believe in God and blah, blah, blah. But it's very interesting. Anyway, let's look at some of the religious implications of what we've said. We've said 2 things so far. Number 1, we've given an explanation for the Big Bang, which is these very strange quantum fluctuations. Right? And number 2, we've answered the question of the Goldilocks paradox, which is to say that there are just simply millions and millions of different universes, each one out there which doesn't support life and ours which does. Okay. Now, Gemara and Chagiga, I should have probably shown you this beforehand as a sort of disclaimer. Anyone who looks at 4 things would have been better off not being created. What is above the universe, what is below it, what was before creation and what was afterwards. Okay? So, Gemara asks, we understand why one should not ask about what is above and what is below and what will be afterwards. But why may one not ask what came before the universe? It happened already, meaning it's not something that should be, we could ask about that. We can ask that. It's a legitimate question to make. It's something that's happened. Why don't we just ask about it? She says, the Gemara, Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar both said, this may be compared to a human king who told his servants, build me a large palace on top of the rubbish heap. And they went and built it. The king does not want the rubbish heap to be remembered or mentioned. I think the Gemara is saying the following. God is not interested in us learning about what happened before the universe was created. It might be very interesting, but actually it's none of our business. He doesn't want that to be mentioned. It's not part of our reality. Okay? So it's not that we can't know what was there before. It's just that it's irrelevant to us. Okay? Now, what we can do, however, is look carefully at the Torah that we have been given. And look at something I mentioned in passing beforehand, but look at the language and look carefully at the language that's used. There are 2 verbs in the Torah that are used to imply creation. One of them is Beis Reish Aleph, the word bara, okay. And the other is Yud Tzadik Reish, which is Yitzira Yotzar, okay, which means also to create. Bara Beis Reish Aleph, as in Bereshis bara Elokeinu es Hashem ha'oretz, implies a creation from nothing. Okay? Yatsar implies a creation of something from something else, a forming, so to speak, of matter that already exists. So here we have it, the first line of the Torah, Bereshis bara Elokeinu es Hashem ha'oretz. There was the beginning of God's creation. He created. Right? But this bara, Beis Reish Aleph, was something from nothing. There was nothing, and then there was something. Now the Malbim says over here, he explains that this Bria implies a creation out of nothing, whereas animals were created out of something. Okay? Because the Torah doesn't say, let's just, let's create animals magically out of nothing, out of thin air. No. It says, let's let the waters swarm with life, or whatever it happens to be. Right. And he goes on and explains a little bit more deeply. Rosh Hashanah service, I don't know if you remember this, but we say over here that God sort of suspends the earth on nothingness. I don't know if this is particularly poetic, I've never used this quote before, but I find it very fascinating that we talk about this bli ma. Bli ma, literally, if you work it out, is bli, without ma. Without ma, what? It's with nothing. There's nothing there. Could it be that what it's saying over here is that the world that we have, that the physical universe that we have, was suspended, came from nothing, came from a nothingness? The Ramban says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. What does it mean? The word in the beginning, Bereshis, means at first, as Onkelos explains, at the beginning. And not a word that means close to the beginning, but rather actually the first thing done. The verse is telling us that in the beginning, God, who is the creator of all forces, created the heavens and the earth. This means that he created these things from absolute nothingness. There was nothing there beforehand. The thing that was created was a small object the size of a mustard seed. Okay. And this was the heavens and everything in it. And there was also another small dot that was created, and this contained the earth and all that is contained in it. This is the primordial matter for the heavens and the primordial matter for the earth. Now this Ramban has been raked over a number of times. What does he really mean? Is it implying an explanation for the Big Bang? Does it match with that? Okay, so it's an interesting Ramban, but it appears to be saying that certainly God created from nothing the entire universe, and the idea of it starting out as something very small and obviously must expand into something bigger, it's quite controversial to say that that's talking about the Big Bang as such, but it's a very interesting concept that he brings out. Now, what are my scientific responses to this? From a religious perspective, we understand that before the Big Bang, before the creation of the world, there was nothing. There was nothing. So how does this work? Now, this is my humble approach. I'll leave it up there for you to read, but I'll tell you without having to read through the whole thing. We've discussed an explanation for the Big Bang from the point of view of looking at a vacuum. The problem is that a vacuum after creation contains quantum states, it contains these quantum field fluctuations and all the rest of it, which is what scientists will tell us is pushing apart these stars and galaxies and everything else, this dark energy. And it could well be that it creates these virtual particles that pop in and out of existence and everything else. But what you're doing is comparing that vacuum, which exists in a post-Big Bang universe, with something that came before the Big Bang. Now, you can't do that. You can't do that, because you're not comparing like with like. Not only that, but if you think about it, it doesn't make any sense at all. Because even though these quantum fluctuations are impossible to measure and happen very rapidly, you still need time in order for something to fluctuate, whatever it happens to be. Without time, what can fluctuate? Nothing can fluctuate. You can't have fluctuations without time. So what existed before the Big Bang, when there was no space, and therefore, as we said at the beginning, no time, couldn't be a vacuum state that we see in this post-Big Bang world. It just can't be. And so the work done by Lawrence Krauss is very fascinating from a scientific perspective. But I think that largely it is a giant red herring. And I would challenge him on this. And he's a very smart man. But I would challenge him and I would say, look, what you're actually doing is redefining the idea of nothing. Okay? And he actually says this at the beginning of his book. He admits at the beginning of his book, what I'm doing is redefining nothing. It's actually having something in it. But that's the best example of nothing that we have, so that's what we have to go with. But that doesn't make any sense at all. Okay. Yeah.
If prior to the creation of the Big Bang, there was no space, was no time, the word before has no meaning. There's no time, you can't have before.
Yeah, that's true. It's a bit like, as someone once said, it's a bit like asking what's north of the North Pole. That's correct. But what we can imagine is time up to that point.
Yeah.
And therefore, you're right in a sense, but that point had to come from somewhere. Because in our minds, you can't have an effect without some cause. This is why HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in a lot of literature, is known as the first cause. I think the Rambam refers to him as the first cause. Okay? So, in the scientific world, of course, you can't do that. You can't just invoke God and say he's the first cause. You have to invoke a scientific theory. And based on what you have as a vacuum state, that these particles pop in and out of existence all the time, it's very interesting. But that doesn't satisfy what I believe to be a pre-Big Bang state of nothingness, which includes no time as well. Okay? So that's the flaw, the gigantic flaw in his argument. I mean, I'm sure he's, convinced a lot of people that we can explain why the Big Bang happened, But I'm not sure that what he's actually done is redefine what was there before the Big Bang, which I'm not sure he can do. Okay? The second question we asked about the Goldilocks paradox, and the fact that scientists can answer that by saying that there is a multiverse. Well, a multiverse is a very fascinating concept, but the problem is, how can you test it? Okay? Now, I'm not saying that it's unscientific, because there was an idea that floated around, an idea of Karl Popper, a famous philosopher of science, who said that science is only ideas that can be tested or falsified. Okay? Now, the truth is you can't falsify an idea of multiverse theory, but it is interesting that scientists are happy to invoke the idea of a multiverse, but not happy to invoke the idea of God. Okay? God doesn't make sense, but a multiverse does make sense, because there are physical processes that allow a multiverse to arise. That's, it's not an unreasonable thing to say. However, once you detect something, you have to at least bring some aspect of it into this universe. So therefore, if we detect it, then it must form part of this universe, not part of another universe. So how that works, I don't know. This is a very interesting dialogue between Richard Dawkins and a guy called Francis Collins, who is a fundamentalist Christian in America, but also a scientist as well. Okay, let's read it. People who believe in God conclude that there must have been a divine knob twiddler who twiddled the knobs of these half-dozen constants to get them exactly right. The problem is that this says, because something is vastly improbable, we need a God to explain it. But that God himself would have been even more improbable. The multiverse theory says that maybe the universe we are in is one of a very large number of universes. The vast majority will not contain life because they have the wrong gravitational constant, or the wrong this constant or that constant. But as the number of universes climbs, the odds mount that a tiny minority of universes will have the right fine tuning. Collins says, this is an interesting choice. Barring a theoretical resolution, which I think is unlikely, you either have to say that there are zillions of parallel universes out there that we can't observe at present, or you have to say that there was a plan. I actually find the argument for the existence of a God who did the planning more compelling than the bubbling of all these multiverses. So Occam says you should choose the explanation that is most simple and straightforward, leads me to believe in God than the multiverse, which seems quite a stretch of the imagination. Dawkins says, I accept that there may be things far grander and more incomprehensible than we can possibly imagine. What I can't understand is why you invoke improbability, and yet you will not admit that you're shooting yourself in the foot by postulating something as improbable, magicking into existence the word God. To me, the right approach is to say that we are profoundly ignorant of these matters. We need to work on them. But to suddenly say the answer is God, it's that seems to me to close off the discussion. Time, this is in Time magazine, this is, could the answer be God? It says there could be something incredibly grand and incomprehensible and beyond our present understanding. Collins says, that's God. Dawkins says yes, but it could be any of a billion gods. Okay? It could be God of the Martians or the inhabitants of Alpha Centauri. The chance of it being a particular God, okay, God of the Jewish people, God of Jesus, is vanishingly small. At the least, the onus is on you to demonstrate why you think that is the case. Interesting argument. Now, we accept that we're a long way from understanding the answers to these questions. I think Lawrence Krauss himself said the lack of understanding something is not evidence of God, it's evidence of a lack of understanding. I agree with that. We're not saying that because we don't understand what happened before the Big Bang, we can then prove that God exists. It must be God. That, as I think I've said over here, is the famous God of the gaps. Okay? We don't understand something, that must be God. So in the past, we didn't understand why there were all these different animals in the world, so it must be that God made them all. Well, now we have evolution theory, so we can explain them, so we don't need God. So the problem with God of the gaps is that it sort of, as soon as the gaps get filled in, God disappears. We're not saying that because we can't explain what happened before the Big Bang, it must mean that God exists. Our faith has to be based on something a little bit more solid, which I alluded to last week. But I think that it's very interesting, I think it's very useful to us to understand that scientists grapple with these issues because they don't make sense. And that the answers that they have put forward have fallen very far short of giving a scientific explanation for the beginning of the universe, the Big Bang itself, and also the fact that the universe appears to be set up perfectly for life. Okay, I've spoken a lot. You haven't asked many questions. I don't know if that's because this has all gone over your heads or because it's all completely clear. You're all experts in this already. But I'm happy to take questions. I think that we can conclude from this series and from particularly this talk that let's be careful not to get carried away with ourselves. I mean, the news today of the evidence for the Big Bang was very exciting. There's an article in the Jerusalem Post which you can have a look at, which looks at the sort of theological implications of that. Personally, for me, I don't need scientists or resolutions of issues in science to bolster my faith. I think faith is something that comes outside of science and outside of resolving issues of perhaps conflicts between science and Torah, as we spoke about last week. And I think that all of these things are very interesting and fascinating and can often add a certain flavour and character to our faith, but it shouldn't form the basis of faith at all. Thank you very much for listening. If you have any further questions, I'll be happy to take them. Yes?
Just from a personal point of view of your own, you obviously are quite happy to use both science and Torah, whether there is a God or isn't a God. It doesn't seem to affect your faith at all. But do you have any conflict between the two, knowing how much you know about both subjects?
I think that my faith comes from a variety of different places, none of which have anything to do with resolving issues in science and Torah. I think faith, different people have a different basis for faith. Some of them can be tested and can be shown to be silly and wrong, and some of them can be very reasonable. And I think what we spoke about last week about Masorah, the chain of transmission, that unbroken chain all the way back to Sinai, is a very rational and reasonable basis for faith. It's not a foolproof, cast iron proof of the existence of God, but it's pretty good in terms of a basis for faith. And also remember that in Judaism, the word faith itself is also a little tainted, because in Judaism we don't really talk. Emunah doesn't mean faith. It doesn't mean bamboozling yourself into believing something despite a lack of evidence or contrary evidence like science. It means understanding the world that you live in and understanding Masorah, and that you're part of that chain of transmission going all the way back to Sinai. But Emunah itself means loyalty, it means faithfulness. Okay, we just read the Megillah. It says that he was oimein es hadosa. To be on an oimein, it means to nurture something. When it says in the Torah reading at the end of Bar Midbar that we read on Purim morning, that Moses held his hands up and his hands were emunah, right? It doesn't mean that his hands had faith. It meant that they were steady, right? So having faithfulness to something, having loyalty to a particular concept, means understanding that there might be questions, but one has to, yes, answer those questions, but not depend on the answers to those questions for faith. Faith has to come from outside of that. So for me, I'm very comfortable with science because I think science is wonderful. And if I spend the rest of my career teaching science to religious communities, that'll be wonderful. I also want to show that there must be no conflict, because there is only one reality. Now, if I have one vision of reality which comes from science and another vision from a more spiritual world, Torah, whatever it happens to be, then those two realities have to meet somewhere. And very often, as I said at the very beginning, these conflicts come not from a genuine conflict, but from a misunderstanding of what science is teaching us, or a misunderstanding of what the Torah is actually teaching us. And so dealing with those conflicts is important. It's important for the community, for people's own mental health and well-being, not to go around with a sort of cognitive dissonance where we want to believe in God, but we've got this baggage that Richard Dawkins is telling us that we can't believe in God because there's evolution. We can deal with those issues, but emunah has to come from somewhere else. Okay? Anything else? Yeah.
So it's not really a question, just sort of thinking that with quantum theory, we can have an effect and then the cause is sort of filled in afterwards. Is that correct?
I'm not sure.
So you can have your subatomic particles that would appear, but then the reason that they appeared follows after they have actually appeared.
Yeah, well, you could.
Is that,
Well, it could be that we never know. We can never know what the reason is that they came about at that particular point, because we can't see them and measure them. We can only measure the after effect. And I understand what you're saying. In quantum theory, is often, because it's misunderstood, because we don't really understand what's going on. It's not that it's misunderstood. We don't understand really what's happening on a quantum level, which means on a very, very tiny level, subatomic level, with subatomic particles. They don't behave in the way that, you know, a billiard ball behaves.
yeah.
Like the days of Newton, where everything was this sort of clockwork universe, it's not like that. So, because it's weird and funky, people take other weird and funky things that we can't explain and link them to quantum theory. So one of the famous things that was done with quantum theory, and in fact does have some mileage, is the issue of consciousness. Okay? Can consciousness be put down to quantum events in your brain, or you know, the sort of free will decisions that we make, right? Can those be put down to you know, some sort of quantum consciousness? Okay, and this idea would have been filed in the rubbish bin of you know, Fruit Loopery had it not been proposed by a very interesting individual called Roger Penrose, who's one of the most eminent scientists in the country. And you know, it's still viewed as being a very sort of pseudoscience, but you know, I'm not 100% sure that we can use quantum theory to explain pretty much anything if we don't really understand what it is. Well, we can, and it's actually a very well-tested theory. It all works, it all fits together. But to explain something outside of that that looks a little bit weird, I'm not sure if we can go that far. The reason that I presented it to you is to show you how weird and wonderful the subatomic world is, and that these virtual particles can very easily pop in and out of existence. Because if we can have particles in two places at once, and with the uncertainty principle, and you know, we can explain all sorts of different things. But it has to have a scientific basis, and I'm not sure that a lot of the uses of quantum theory necessarily do. So I haven't answered your question because I don't know the answer, but I think that we have to be careful in how we use quantum theory.
It almost seems like you have quantum theory, then this observable, measurable world we live in,
Yes.
and then a huge world which almost is exactly the same as this quantum world of not understanding exactly how things are interacting.
Yeah. I mean, the work that was done in quantum theory, which I use in one of my other talks, which we didn't cover this evening, actually looks, there was a scientist, I forget his name, who asked a very simple question. At what point does the experiment switch from being that interference pattern to being those two bars? At what point is it being observed? Is it observed? Is the machine detecting it? Is that observing it? Because that has no consciousness. That's just a detector, right? Is it? You know, if we looked away, would it do the same thing, right? And I'm not sure exactly what the answer is, but at what point, you know, is the observation made? So that's where the whole interaction between consciousness and there's some very interesting ideas, right? That means our consciousness, our ability to observe, affects the physical world. Well, the same thing is true with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. His way of creating through speech, whatever it is, also creates the world. So there are some parallels possibly, but I'm not sure if we can. We don't really understand it. So how can we make connections between the two? I would steer away from it and leave it as a very interesting thing, and leave the theology out of it.
So
Yes.
It's part of the conflict, inability to understand some of these theories from the religious or the scientific out, that we haven't got the language for it. You gave up the concept of Imuna doesn't mean faith, it means faithfulness, and we're using some terminologies which on one side of the argument they actually mean one thing, and on the other side of the argument they mean another thing.
Yeah.
A bit like Babel. That we're not, we're not actually using the right language.
Correct.
To explain, and therefore what we're trying to explain is not explicable.
Yes. I mean, that's on a very fine level. On a much coarser level, the Torah itself is often only studied as a translation, which therefore loses a lot of the subtlety and nuance. And also, the function of the Torah is misunderstood. So we look at the Torah perhaps as a description of the creation of the universe, which appears to be what it's doing. But actually, in reality, the lessons that we learn from the Torah are far different. You know, it really has nothing to do with a scientific description of the creation of the universe. It has much more to do with the importance of creation and our position in creation and the nature of male and female and Adam and Eve and sin and those sorts of much more pertinent issues to human beings. Those are the sorts of things that the Genesis story is actually teaching us. And that's why a lot of the sort of argument, the scientific argument against the Torah really doesn't make any sense. That, again, it's like comparing apples with oranges. You know, I mean, okay, they're both fruit, but they're not really the same thing. So that's when we end up with all these conflicts. And just by understanding what the Torah is actually teaching us helps us to resolve these conflicts and realize the Torah was never teaching us about the age of the universe or you know, the order of creation necessarily. Okay? Yeah.
Having attended audio classes, you obviously have no difficulty reconciling science and Torah. A close friend of my wife and myself taught for many years at a Haredi school in Manchester.
Right.
She's not Haredi herself. That school employed a censor.
Yes.
Whose job was actually literally to go through all the books in the library and tear out pages that contained words, phrases that were
like dinosaur.
challenging, like dinosaur, evolution, Big Bang. What are they afraid of?
Right, that's a good question. I often get asked this question, and I mean, you probably remember that I showed you a picture where I took my children fossil hunting, okay, in Lyme Regis. Okay, so at the time, my eldest, Yeshaya, was nagging me to put a picture into Mishpacha magazine. Okay, Mishpacha magazine is like a sort of Haredi magazine. Okay, so you know, he'd drawn all sorts of different pictures. We just hadn't got around to putting them in. And you know, we were on holiday, so I said, if I draw a nice picture and we'll submit it to Mishpacha, and you know, we'll get them to publish it on their pictures page. So what does he do? He comes home from fossil hunting and he draws pictures of ammonites. Okay, and I said to him, Shai, of all the things that you could draw to submit to Mishpacha, pictures of fossils is probably not going to get published, right? Now the difficulty is that you're dealing with a community which I have a lot of respect for, and in some way, you know, I have one foot in the Haredi world, given that my children go to a very Haredi school. But I also recognise that challenge, and I think the problem is that in a culture where there is a party line in the way that you think, particularly with these particular issues, it has the function of dampening any sort of debate, of sort of squashing any debate, because they're afraid that if you ask all the wrong questions and you don't have the kalim, you don't have the ability and the tools to give reasonable, understandable answers to those questions, better just not to have those questions at all. Okay? Now, I understand that. I happen to think it's wrong, and I don't think it's a healthy approach, because what happens is, in any scenario, the higher you build walls, the more tempting it is to look over what's on the other side. There's only a certain amount of lying that you can do to children before they start to ask very good questions. And the danger is that if children do realise that actually, you know, think that, you know, they've been lied to, that things have been, you know, that knowledge, information has been withheld because, you know, it doesn't make any sense, or you can't find good answers to it. The danger is that those children will grow up with a very warped view of the world, will not tolerate views that are outside of their own particular perspectives, and won't have the tools with which to deal with these questions when they do come up in real life, which inevitably they do. So, you know, it's very, very difficult. It's a very difficult tightrope to walk in those communities. You know, what do you do? Because the problem is you can't simply expose children to these questions and leave them to try and find answers to them, because they don't have the ability to answer the questions. When you teach children Torah, you don't teach it with the Malbim and all the Rashis and the Rambams and everything else to explain what's going on. You have to teach it in a very simplistic way. So children will understand it in a very simplistic way. And the obvious questions are, well, what about the dinosaurs? When did they live? And when, you know, having a method by which to teach children how to deal with questions of science and religion is a golden problem, I suppose, which needs to be addressed, not just in the Haredi world, in the wider Jewish educational system and in other religious educational systems as well. What's happened over the last decade or so is that the entire agenda has been dominated by Christian fundamentalism in America, which is where there's been a lot of backlash from the scientific community, because over there they will refuse to teach evolution at all and will only teach creationism, and you know, that forms part of the science lessons. My humble opinion is that you should teach science in science lessons and teach theology in theology lessons. And you deal with the conflict between that in the best way that you can. Either you come and see me, or you find someone else who can answer these questions in a way that children, that young people can understand. So my wife is a biology teacher, so she teaches evolution in Hasmonean. Right? She has to. She's also done a sort of special class that goes through some of the issues that we raised on the second class, that deal with the approaches within Judaism of dealing with evolution, to show the kids that, you know, there are solutions. We have thought about this. It's not a big kasha. It's not such a big question. So don't ruin your faith because you believe in Torah and you think all of this is fear and it's all, you know, it's denial of Torah and everything else. It's not. The Rambam himself said, if you want to build your faith in God, study science. Look at the world around you. Look at the world that God created. When you do that with an open mind, it's a much healthier scenario than shutting off those avenues to not be explored because they're forbidden, because it's kafira. It's not kafira. It's not kafira to study the world. Okay? So, you know, that's my humble opinion. We had somebody speak recently in Northwood, and it was one of those situations where I'd asked this person to speak about a particular subject, and the first thing they did was stand up and said, I'm not going to speak about the subject I was asked to speak about, but I am going to speak about the subject which I don't know anything about, but I think this is more important, and proceeded to talk to my own Balabatim about science and religion and evolution and her issue with evolution. She came from very, you know, mainstream Haredi background. And you know, I mean, most of my Balabatim are actually very kind with her, but they basically wipe the floor with her. You know, it's a ridiculous scenario. So it's a very good question. I don't have a solution, and I think that within the Haredi world, I think they're probably scared to address the issue properly. I think that the party line is that evolution, because it's misunderstood, is kafira, and it's, you know, it implies that there's no God and everything else. I also think the scientific community have not done themselves any favours by turning evolution into a battle of science and religion, although it's not really their fault. It's what's happened in America, particularly in 2005, with some of the court cases there. But the whole situation is a bit of a mess. And if there's anything that I can do over my rabbinic career to redress that, then, you know, that will be an aim of mine to sort of redress that balance a little bit. Yeah.
I keep butting you, sorry about this.
That's okay.
But isn't the other side of that problem that the senior members of the scientific world are basically telling the layperson who hasn't got that much understanding of either religion or science, God doesn't really, yeah, we're proven God doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And the lay people therefore take it that, well, science has proven that God doesn't exist,
Yeah.
therefore all the morality that's in the Tanakh, in the Bible, in whichever testament they read, they've also got no foundation at all.
Yeah.
God says, don't kill. God doesn't exist, so I can go and kill someone. God says, don't rob, I can steal what I want to.
It's not quite that simple.
It's not simple, but it,
Because what they would actually say, and I watched a YouTube video where somebody asked Richard Dawkins, said to him, Professor Dawkins, without God there is no such thing as objective morality, which is true. Therefore, you know, we need God in order to give us a sense of morality. And he sat there and said, what morality? The God of the Torah, where he tells you to kill the entire nation of Amalek, the children as well, is that moral? Or in Islam, where you go around cutting people's hands off for stealing, is that moral? You know, and he said, as a human race, we can come to an agreement of what is moral and what is immoral. And we have a very good way of sitting down together and working these issues out together and deciding what falls in the boundaries of being moral and what falls outside of that boundary. So they would argue very strongly you don't need God to define morality. And in fact, if you look at God in the Torah, it doesn't look very moral at all. There's a lot